Hello and welcome to today's episode of Spec Stepping, where we are stepping through the web API spec. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the console API. Now, if you have been doing any sort of web development for any length of time, you have come across this API. So hopefully, at least, this is an invaluable API when you're doing web development. It helps you when you're working with the dev tools to be able to uh, log elements like variables or log objects to your console to see how the values are behaving and things. I use it on every project I work on. Now you don't want it in production. Just to be fair, just a tip, you don't want this information to be out there in production, but when you're developing, it's a great tool to use. So, as typical, there's a bunch of documentation and examples on it here, but let's go ahead and let's look at the console demo here that I've got. Let me just refresh my screen. And there's not going to be, because I'm using the console API is about the console within the DevTools, and I didn't bother outputting the console DevTool results to the screen. So there's not going to be much as far as HTML and CSS, but I wanted you to focus more on the console. So I'm going to go through each one of these and I'm going to flip back and forth between the code and here so that you can see where all these messages from where they're coming. So first, let me slip back to the code. So again, actually I have a bad message there, old message on my previous spec stepping video. So in this one, we're going to be doing the console API demo. The HTML, because we're doing a demo of the console, is pretty minimal. There's not going to be much there. It's just placeholder, basically. The important thing is that I'm serving up the console API JavaScript file. Okay, and then style, pretty minimal. I just have style. In fact, I don't even need that one. The style is pretty minimal. I looked at doing some buttons and things like that, but I'm not going to do that. So my style is just showing the basically the background and stuff like that. So just some basic styles, nothing fancy, nothing that pertains to the console. So just kind of placeholder type stuff. The real magic happens here in the JavaScript file. So I'm going to go through each one of these and then flip over to the screen here so that you can see kind of where this stuff comes from. So this one is probably used the most, the console log. So the console API provides us a console object, and there are a bunch of methods and properties and things like that off of this console object. So the first one, the one probably used most often, is the log. So you see it says hello from console log, and that's where this comes from, hello from console log. But that's not the only thing we can do. So here we can do console.info, console.warn, and console.error. So info is basically similar to log. It's just an informational message. So you may wonder, well, why do you have the two? In your coding, you may have some stuff that you want to have show on the screen as actual logging, like of an error that you're catching in your development, or another stuff that just may be information, and you may want them to show up in different spots, and it's just a semantic thing. The warning and the errors really have a difference as opposed to the log and the informational one, where they have some visual difference. So warning is going to be this yellow. It's going to have it may be a little different depending on what browser you're using. I'm using Brave, which is a Chromium-based browser. And so it's yellow with this orangish triangle, and an error has got this reddish background with the red circle with the white X on it. So that's helpful if you actually do want to throw warnings and errors like from try catches. The third item is when you are logging, you don't just have to log out or can only just log out text like I did here. I can actually log out objects. And this is one I use quite often, where I have a string, and then this comma here is pretty important, because then the string is like a heading. And then here I'm actually outputting this object of username Alice, age 30, admin true. So if I go over here, here is where I'm outputting user object name Alice, 30, admin true. If you want to expand it, you can click that little arrow and see it in a vertical, which that may be helpful if you have a long object that's being truncated in your view. You can expand it. In this case, this only has 3 items on it. And then inspecting an object with the dir method. So it's basically provides an interactive list of an object. So here I'm going to do the same user of Alice here. So that's this one right here. And you see it does basically the same thing as up here. Me personally, I prefer this one up here because I can get interactive and work and drill down into it. Um, and I have the header here. That's what I personally prefer. Totally up to you. But while I'm here, both of these have this prototype object, which is beyond the scope of this particular video. Maybe I'll do a video down the road on this, but this is a very handy tool as far as digging into an object and seeing what is in its prototype. What are some methods and things that I can use, some properties that I can use to work with this particular, in this case, an object. You can also do this with arrays and basically any variable that has information. You can log it to the console and inspect it. Now, there might come a time where this may be handy for you, number 5 here, where I'm grouping messages together. So it's got this group method, and I have a title here, user details. And here I'm just grabbing the different pieces of that object and then group in. Basically, what you're telling the console is, okay, what follows my group after the title user details are several things I want to log out that I want to kind of chunk together. And then group in basically ends that. So here's user details. Here is minimized. So that's that title, and I can expand it. And here I have name Alice, age 30, admin true. So you may be asking yourself, why would I do this as opposed to this up here? Well, there may be a time, in this case, it doesn't make huge sense because all of these are coming from the same user, and it's probably just easier to just log out that object. But say you're in a scenario where you have different objects and different arrays that are somewhat related, and you have some complex data structures, and you're trying to debug them and see what information is contained in them at different points in your logic flow and all that stuff. That's where this comes in handy, because you can basically group different pieces of the puzzle together to see how they are related to each other kind of in one stream. So imagine, for example, that I have 3 different arrays or objects here and not just all one. I can group them all together and see kind of in one spot where they're at, as opposed to maybe could I dump them all to the console? Yes, I have done that. But sometimes you're working with objects and arrays that are huge, and it makes it a little difficult to work with. So just a little tip there. And then if you're ever doing any looping logic and you're wondering how many times does this thing run through and cycle through, that's where the count method comes into play. So here I just have a for loop that's just going through 3 times. And so here, just minimize the user details, it actually counts the loop. So loop 1, loop 2, loop 3. So it actually recognizes I'm in a loop. I'm counting how many times this is going to run. Loop count, that object that it takes in the string in this case, is just the title of it. So it just puts the loop count colon. So handy if you're doing some looping through things and you're concerned about performance and making sure things run a certain amount of time and all that sort of good stuff. That can be handy. The timing, again, another performance, at least I use it a lot for performance related stuff, is the console time end. So here I have console time timer example. And then here I have, it puts the, here's the timer example thing. And then here I have from 0 to, and this is all milliseconds. So this would be 1 million milliseconds. And then I have timer end. Now, I'm not really doing anything here to make this last longer. So you can see it's like 1.4 milliseconds, which is quicker than I could just snap. Now, where this would come in handy is if you're having a lot of heavy processing of data and you want to see how long is this going to take. A lot of programming languages have this. If you come from the C# world, they have this the stopwatch concept where you can do the same thing. It's just different object, different language, different syntax, but same concept, where you have a timer that you're starting, you're doing some work, timer ending, you're stopping that timer, and it tells you how long it's going to work. So you can wrap like a long loop or a long piece of code and see how long is it taking to do this. I do this sometimes with some API calls. So where I'm wrapping it and I'm going to say, okay, how long is it going to take to do this API call, get the API call back, and then maybe I'll wrap even the processing of the API call that I'm doing locally just to see how long it takes. So I can work on some performance things in my application. So here it's really quick because I'm not doing anything within the for loop. So it's really, really quick. So handy little tool. And then stack trace. Anytime you want to sift through a stack trace of code, you can use the trace here. So here I've got just three functions that don't really do anything, but you can imagine where you have three functions and you're calling because you're using OOP principles. You may have separation of concerns and single responsibility principle and encapsulation stuff all going on. And you have these different functions that are calling each other. And that can lead to some complex stacking. And you have some errors and things, and you're trying to follow through the stack. So here I have an function called A that calls B, B calls C, and in C, I'm doing the trace. So you'd want to do it where at the level that you're wanting to do the stack trace. Now, side note, you can get into some of the same information in other parts of the dev console. This is just helpful and handy sometimes when you do it on the console log, or log into the console itself. So here I have this trace from function C. So trace from function C, that's where that comes from, that's that string. And if I expand it, it shows me where the stack went through. Now, this is a pretty simplistic one, to be fair. So I started in C, went to B, went to A. So the call went from A to B to C, but then it came back up through the stack trace from C to B to A. So it shows how you can trace up through a stack. So again, you can get to that information in other places, but just wanted to show it to you here. And then table output. This is a very handy one, especially if you're dealing with a lot of tabular type data. So here I have a couple users. This is not complex data and may not be necessary, but we'll show the demo of what this does. So what I can do is I can take data and I can call console.table, pass an object to it. And what's nice is it actually puts it in a nice little formatted table there for me with columns and rows. So I can see all the data in a nice spreadsheet-like format, which is really handy when you're trying to read data. So imagine, if you will, here I have the same object up here, but imagine you had a ton of users and a lot of information in this. This one up here may not be as handy as a table. So a console table is very handy for a lot of that. You can't actually expand underneath it to see what is in that item. In this case, it's an array of two objects. So you can't expand it underneath it to get into something similar like was up here, but the table is very handy. And then lastly, you can use a styled log message. So here I have this placeholder with the %C, and then after that I have a string of styles, and it actually styles out the log message. So you can do some of that stuff to see. And in fact, I have actually seen some of that stuff used in production. I think Facebook, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to put a styled log message in the dev tools that you'd see where it would basically say, hey, this is the dev tools, and you maybe want to be careful about being here if you're just a regular user and not a developer type of thing. I forget the exact verbiage, but you can style out your log message. I don't use that too much, but it is handy to have in the tool belt if you ever need it. So that's pretty much the overview of probably the more common, at least that I've used, more common console API methods and things to do. The log you'll use a ton, but there's some other ones that are very helpful in your development and design process. If you have any questions, let me know. And if not, happy stepping.